You know, we begin all our programs on time, except when they're not. So we're a few minutes late, but we'll make up for it. My usual first announcement for one of those dinners, let me know and I'll arrange it for you. It's a wonderful experience. I don't want to take away time from Yossi and from David, because they both have to catch flights, I assume, to APAC. And which is one of the reasons we won't have Q&A tonight. Yossi wrote a wonderful book. I had one here, I guess somebody stole it. In the Synagogue. It's a wonderful book. You remember the iconic picture of IDF soldiers looking up at the Kotel. Within a few minutes of conquering the Kotel. And he traces their lives and shows what's really happened to society in Israel, the different conflicting points of view and so forth. David is well known to us. He doesn't have his regular jacket, but it's still David. Gentlemen, I turn over the program to you.
Thank you, Asher. Hope you hear me okay. What's up, everybody? Thank you for coming. Sorry to disappoint you, Asher, about the jacket. We could ask Yossi about why buses don't run the way we want them to as well, but we're going to focus on his writing tonight. I've known Yossi for a long time, for 20-something years, certainly. They can turn me out, okay? Just tell me towards the back there. You hear me okay at the back? Not so. Okay, people with technical skills. I'll keep talking, getting better. I can hear myself just fine, you see. Any better? Gentleman in the red top there in the back there. Can you hear me okay? So maybe even a little louder. I've known Yossi for more than 20 years. I worked with him at the Jerusalem Report, kept in touch with him, and he was writing books even then, and then spent, as we'll talk about in a little while, about 11 years working on this extraordinary book, which I think Asher summed up beautifully. We'll talk about that a little bit. But first, Yossi, it isn't the first book that you wrote. The first one was Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, which was more about your childhood and growing up in the United States and so on. And then you wrote a beautiful book about the possibilities of interfaith interaction, called The Entrance to the Garden of Eden. Just tell us a little bit about those endeavors, and then we'll come on to my dreams.
I think I can, first of all, good evening everyone, Shabbat Tov. And David, I'm thrilled to be doing this with you. Really, really thank you for doing this. In a way, I think I can divide my friends into two groups, those who like my first book and those who like my second book. The first book is about growing up in a little shtetl called Borough Park in Brooklyn. There we go. 51st Street and 17th Avenue. I just met somebody here who grew up on the same street. And it's about growing up as a second generation in the 60s and the early 70s, being involved in the Soviet Jewry movement and getting involved with the JDL in those early years. And it's about the appeal of Jewish extremism and then how I extricated myself from that way of thinking. And the second book is it's called The Entrance to the Garden of Eden. And it was about a journey that I took as a religious Jew into Islam and Christianity in this land, as a way of seeing whether religious people could be religious people together here. And then this book is very different. It's the first book I wrote, which is not about me, although I think it very much is. I think it's really about all of us. It's about a group of paratroopers who fought in Jerusalem in 1967, 7 paratroopers, and the book traces the evolution of these 7 men through the subsequent history of Israel. One part of this group became leaders and founders, actually, of the settlement movement, and the other part became active on the left, and they were all kibbutzniks. So it's really about settlers and kibbutzniks.
And this was the book that you set out to write? You decided, I mean, it's really kind of a magisterial opus. it's the story of Israel since '67. To some extent, it's the story of the battle for the direction of this country, the soul of this country. That's what you set out to do. How did you get going to this?
I didn't. I think one of the reasons why this book took so long to write is I was not sure initially what it was about. In fact, I told my wife at the time that this will be a quick book.
Same wife you told her at the time.
Yes, and she stayed with me through the 11 years. And I said to Sarah that this book will be a quick one, 2 years, and we're done. And I thought I would interview a few paratroopers and Shalom Israel.
The idea was to speak to members of this unit.
Yeah, and just
about for Jerusalem.
About for Jerusalem and what happened to them since. And after 2 years, I realized that I wrote a book, and I had committed to my publisher that within 2 years the book will be done. And I said to my editor, I'm sorry, these things happen. They happen pretty regularly, but there's no book, and let's just cut our losses. And she said, well, wait a minute, let's unpack this. And it was her idea, actually, hers and Michael Lawrence and a few other friends who were brainstorming and trying to help me out of this. And saying, well, why don't we take a few of these men and tell the story of Israel since '67 through their lives. And that was a fateful decision because I really mortgaged my life to this project, and it became my full-time work for the next 9 years.
And you learned the history of Israel as you were writing the book, right?
Oh, definitely.
Some of these people, before '67, many of them were central to future rounds of conflict, and you didn't even know, right? You guys see these people initially, and you knew too little about them.
First, I went to see one of the men who became a central figure in this book, Glassman. He was the Chief Intelligence Officer of Brigade 55, the paratrooper brigade, and he was the one who planned the crossing into Jerusalem in '67. And in our first meeting, I said to him, so tell me what you did after '67. He said, well, I was the senior commander who led the paratroopers across the canal in 1973. And I said, wait a minute, you mean you were the same guys from Jerusalem who crossed the canal with Sharon and won the Yom Kippur War? And his response was, go home, do your homework, and when you know something a little bit more about who we are, come back and we'll talk. So that's another reason why this book took so long, is because I had a lot of homework to do. And I think that, in a sense, and I think you'll appreciate this, David, we Olim came into the story. I came in 1982, you came around that same time. And we basically knew the story of Israel, but we knew it, I'd say, in its broadest strokes. And what this book helped me do was really fill in the color and the texture of the story. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to put myself back into those parts of the story that I had missed. My Israel really begins in 1982 when I moved here, and so in some sense, retroactively, I was able to learn what it was that had actually happened here.
And what emerged, and what the book sets up, are two. This is, and we all know this is not a normal country, and what emerges here is these players who have conflicting visions of what this country should be. You say messianistic visions, utopian visions. But it can't be a normal country, it has to be a light unto the nations from a liberal, secular, kibbutz mindset, or a conflicting ideology that it was genuine in the halachic sense, I suppose, settling the land and ushering the Messiah.
The literal Messiah.
Right. So how tell us how your conception that that's what's at stake here. You have these two conflicting movements battling for the soul and direction of this country.
I think when the book really came into focus was when I made a list of all the characters that were appealing to me, people that I wanted to put in the book, and I was trying to see what were the the characteristics. How could I begin to break this down? And the first obvious category was left and right. But a second, and to my mind, more compelling way of grouping these men came into focus, which was religious Zionists who became settlers, and kibbutzniks who became active in Peace Now. And it was the kibbutz movement and the religious Zionist movement that ultimately pulled this story together. Because as you just said, Nathan, it was really, these were the two movements that imagined that the state of Israel needed to be more than just a refuge, a safe refuge for the Jewish people. But every time I say that, just a safe refuge, I mean, what would we give if we actually could be a safe refuge? And these two movements wanted more. They really wanted, they envisioned the return of the Jewish people home as the trigger to world transformation. The founders of the kibbutz movement imagined that Israel would be the laboratory for the purest form of democratic communism, which it was, but in the end it didn't matter. And of course, as you say, the settlers, at least initially, we hear much less about the messianic side of the goal of the settlement movement, but in the early years it was very pronounced. And there it was very much an explicitly religious idea of redemption. And there are really, I think, there are many ways of dividing Zionism, classical Zionism, into different camps. And one of the ways is between the messianists or the utopians and the normalizers. And in the camp of the normalizers are, for example, the revisionists. Jabotinsky was the ultimate normalizer. He envisioned the transformation that Zionism would bring in very practical terms of self-defense and refuge. And in the camp of the messianists or the utopians, you have the kibbutzniks and the religious Zionists. So in a sense, this book tells the story of a kind of civil war within the camp of the utopians. Because I put the religious Zionists and the kibbutzniks in the same camp. The fact that this book is about the war between them is and one can really ask the question, who won? Who won this war? And at least the way it looks now, the normalizers.
Yeah, I was going to say, the first 30 years, divided as you like, of the revived state, it was the kibbutz ideology that shaped the country. Then there was a period where certainly the settlement movement was dominant. I wonder now if those ambitions of the settlement movement are being, if we're witnessing them being constrained, and if the country is becoming, for better or worse, more normal.
I think that is what's happening. At least that's certainly internally. I think one of the ironies for Zionism is that the founders of Zionism imagined, certainly Ben-Gurion and Herzl for that matter, imagined Israel to be externally normal in its relations with the international community, but internally exceptional. And sometimes it seems as if we've managed the reverse. And at least that's how it seems at this moment. But I think one thing we've learned about the history of Israel is how fluid it is. And what seems certain at this moment could be a completely different reality a year or two, or certainly 5 or 10 years.
I think what's happening in the region now is very humbling for anyone who tries to predict anything. And maybe we'll come back to later in the conversation to the period after the book is done. Let's come back now to some of these characters. There's 7 key characters, really. 5 of whom, am I right, are still alive?
Yes.
Hanan, Parat, and Ariel being the 2 exceptions. So you spent lots of time with those 5, and in Ariel's case, with people close to him. So who were the characters who most captured your soul? Or all 7?
All 7 in different ways. And even one of the characters who I had the least resonance with politically or spiritually, and that's a guy named Udi Adiv, and those of you who've read the book will know what I'm talking about. Udi Adiv was a kibbutznik from Gan Shmuel who after the Six-Day War, went so far left that he joined a tiny anti-Zionist movement called Glassman, went to Syria in 1972, tried to start an anti-Zionist terrorist group, spent 12 years in an Israeli prison, a very famous story for our generation of Israelis. And when I went to see him for the first time, I said to him, you know, with everything you represent, I fundamentally disagree with you, but I have a strong personal resonance with you as an extremist. I said, we share that. I was on the other end of the extremist spectrum, but I appreciate the extremist personality. And that became a kind of a bond of trust between us. I spent years sitting with him and trying to understand him, trying to get his story.
Risks his life in '67, fights to liberate Jerusalem. What happened?
Well,
how did he go?
Yeah.
I mean, in the book, I don't remember exactly, but you know, it sounds horrific what you've said,
Yes.
and yet it's not quite, you know, it sounds like you kind of got drawn into something, you didn't quite realise what he was doing, sort of thing, right? That's still a pretty radical shift.
Well, he grew up in a very radical kibbutz, Gan Shmuel, which was a kibbutz of Hashomer Hatzair, the Marxist Zionist movement at the time, Marxist, and pro-Stalin, in fact. Gan Shmuel had a photograph of Lenin after the Six-Day War hanging in its old palm room in 1968, 69. And so he grew up in this very charged ideological atmosphere. And you know, the kibbutzim were not at all homogeneous. Even the kibbutzim within the same movement had very different tones. Ein Shemer, which is a kibbutz next to Gan Shmuel, and we're talking about an area that's near the Mishulash, the triangle near Umm between Umm and Hadera, and two kibbutzim of Hashomer Hatzair. And yet Ein Shemer was much more relaxed, cultural. It just seemed like a much happier place to grow up in. And Gan Shmuel was very dogmatic. And I think that one has to really ask why Udi Adiv and not other young people who grew up in that atmosphere. Nevertheless, he did carry the ideology to an extreme. Obviously, teaching at the Open University in Haifa.
What does he teach?
Political science. I was reading talkbacks to one of the reviews in my book where this came out, and somebody wrote, "Well, of course, he's an academic."
Okay, so now let's swing across the spectrum and being extremely serious now. We've just marked 20 years since the Goldstein massacre in Hebron, and Hanan Porat, in circles where he is notorious for ostensibly having made light of the massacre because it was Purim. Now, you actually, I think you bring new information to light, and you certainly bring in an interpretation that you were very anxious to bring to Hanan Porat and that massacre.
I think that the argument that the book makes is that an avel, what would you say? An avel, someone help me here?
Yes.
An injustice. An injustice was done to the late Hanan Porat. Those of you who may recall the story, now I'll sum it up. Purim morning, Hanan Porat, who was really the founder of the settlement movement, and the morning of the Goldstein massacre, Hanan went to Hebron to support his friends who were under extraordinary pressure at that moment. And as he told the story, he did not go to support the massacre, quite the opposite. He very much opposed it, and he understood that this would do great damage to the settlement movement. And he shows up into an emergency meeting in the municipality Kiryat Arba, and there's a TV crew from Channel 2 waiting outside the door. And the reporter asks him, Chanan Porat, what do you have to say? And he says, Chag Sameach. And she says to him, Ata Sameach, are you happy? And he says, you say Chag Sameach no matter what. And then he condemned the man. He said, I consider this to be a terrible event. That was erased from the TV report, and instead what you saw was Chanan Porat smiling and saying Chag Sameach. Now, this is a very complicated story, because on the one hand, the way in which this was edited really was a deep injustice to Chanan, and the way that this was projected to the public was that Chanan was happy and supported the massacre. On the other hand, he was smiling and said Chag Sameach in a way that his critics within the settlement noted that if, God forbid, Jews had been massacred that morning, Chanan Porat would not have said Chag Sameach with a smile. So he said it with a smile not because he supported the massacre, but he didn't convey the weightiness of the moment. There was something a little bit trivializing in his response. And so I think that he didn't deserve the full weight of the condemnation, but he deserved to be scrutinized. And so the way in which I tried to tell this story is to give full credibility to his version. And then I turned the narrative over to his friend, Yossi, who is one of the 7 characters, one of the main characters in the story, also one of the founders of the settlement movement, who later becomes, I'd say, the great heretic of the settlement movement. And Yossi makes the point that Chanan should have been aware of his demeanor. He's an old hand at media, and he should have been much more careful about how he projected. So,
for the full nuanced description, you need to read the book, and you brought us on to your opinion. For me, reading the book was certainly the most, I suppose, dramatic character. For me, certainly sometimes the most infuriating, because I thought, and he's very much alive, so he will be able to put his own interpretations on everything. But the sense that here is someone who, and not alone, who feels or purports to feel that they know the will of God. I found that so frustrating. That's a kind word. And acted on the basis of his perception of what the divine power would want, with sometimes pretty dramatic and not always beneficial consequences. I found him such a problematic, complicated, dramatic character, and I would venture to suggest so do you. But I think he's maybe the central character of the book.
yeah, I think he is the central character. And you had asked me earlier, and I didn't answer the question, who are the characters who I most identify with? And I would say it's Rav Yoel Binur and Arik Achmon, who was the man who I mentioned earlier, the chief intelligence officer who then led the crossing of the canal, and was actually a former kibbutznik who became a father of capitalist Israel. He became the first privatizer of a government company. It was Arkia, a domestic airline. And he fought the Histadrut, the all-powerful labor union, in the early 80s, and broke the Histadrut and opened the way for the dismantling of the statist economy that I think was really holding us back. So those are the 2 figures, one from the left, one from the right, who I most identify with. And I most identify with them because each of them changed their minds. So it's interesting, David, that what you pick up so strongly and object so strongly about Rav Yoel is his insistence that he knows the will of God. What I find so moving about him was the courage that he had to go against his world, in the same way that Arik Achmon had courage to go against the kibbutz and the socialist world that he came from. And Arik had been a very strong supporter of the Oslo process, and after the Second Intifada concluded that there's no chance to reach an agreement with the Palestinians. So, I spoke earlier about dividing the characters, or about dividing Zionism rather, into different camps. I would divide the characters in this book not necessarily into left and right, but into the camp of those who changed over the years, whether left or right, who evolved and who tried to grapple with changing circumstance and to understand Israel's needs in a shifting reality on the one hand, and on the other hand, the camp of those who you meet at the beginning of the book, and they are who they are at age 22 or 23, and they remain who they are at the end of the book. And the people who I really prefer, perhaps because of my own biography, are those who've gone through major changes.
Well, it's intellectually much harder to evolve. It's much easier in all aspects of life to be a zealot and unthinkingly to follow the same course. The challenge is to adjust and mend and be honest with yourself and so on. So we've seen that extraordinarily ironic shift of the kibbutznik who becomes the arch capitalist. Tell us a little bit about Benun and where you see this evolution.
Well, I think also it's not only intellectually difficult, but these people also pay a very high social price. They tend to become pariahs to some extent in their communities, and that certainly happened to Rav Yoel. He was one of the founders of Gush Emunim. He was the founder of Alon Shut in Gush Etzion. He and his wife Esther were the first settlers of Alon Shut, and then he went on to become one of the founders of Ofra. And there were a number of of milestones along the way for him, and the first moment where you really feel him beginning to question where Israeli society is going and whether his own camp is fully aware of some of the negative consequences of the left-right schism happens in 1983 when a grenade is thrown into a Peace Now demonstration. And Emil Grunsweig was killed, a Peace Now demonstrator. And later on it was discovered that it was a Jew who threw the grenade. And it turns out that Emil Grunsweig was a paratrooper who was close with Yoav Benun. And so this is the first shattering for him. And the second shattering happens a year later with the uncovering of what became known as the Machteret Yehudit, the Jewish underground, which was a group of very prominent figures from the settlements who were involved in some terrorist acts against Arab civilians. They were arrested after a group of them had put bombs on Arab buses in East Jerusalem. If those bombs would have gone off, there would have been dozens of people killed. And one of the central figures in the Jewish underground turned out to be Yoav Benun's most beloved student, who is also a figure in the book, and Yehuda Zion. And so this becomes another shattering. The final shattering for Rav Yoel happens with the Rabin assassination. And you'll remember this very well, David. We were working together then at the Jerusalem Report, and I spent a good deal of time following Yoav Benun after the Rabin assassination because he went public against his own community. And the background...
Or failing to examine itself properly.
Yes. And there's more to that story. I don't really have time to go. I don't think we have time to go into all the details. The book does go into that. But the background that the Israeli public did not know at the time, and which I discovered only in my relationship with him, was that Yoel Ben Nun had developed a back channel to Rabin during the Oslo years. And he was working very closely with Rabin to try to mitigate the security complications for the settlers as a result of the Oslo process. And he and Rabin developed a partnership. And they really came to love each other. And Yoel would send faxes to Rabin, and he saved all of his faxes and gave me access to them, and they're just fascinating. Someday someone really should do a doctorate on this relationship, because Yoel is in these faxes is deeply critical of Rabin. There's one fax where he writes, Kvod Rosh HaMamshala. He's always very respectful, and then he writes, he says, I used to think that at least I understood what your policy was, even though I so bitterly disagree with it. He said, now I don't have a clue what you're doing, and I wonder whether you know. This is to the Prime Minister of Israel. And I said, how did he respond? He said he invited me in for a talk afterwards. And so, and this was really the extraordinary, it says so much about Rabin. It says so much about Israel. And that sense of informality, and where every citizen feels that he has the right and the responsibility to challenge the powers that be. And that Rabin took it, not only took it, but really wanted to hear from a political opponent for whom he had deep respect. And they used to sit for hours. And I interviewed Eitan Haber, who was Rabin's chief of staff. And I said, how did Rabin respond to these meetings with Yoel? And he said, he told me that anytime Yoel Ben Nun wants a meeting, you arrange it immediately. His faxes were placed on Rabin's desk. Rabin would take them home with him for his Shabbat reading. And he took this relationship very seriously. And so, you know, when you go behind the scenes and you look at the finer resolutions of the Israeli story, it's extraordinary. In its broad strokes, the story is extraordinary. But when you realize the nuances and the relationships, and I think that the story in the end that I tried to tell here is about what an intimate story this is. And when the story is projected abroad, there's a left-wing narrative and a right-wing narrative. But this is the same story. These were men who fought together. They shared the same metaphorical and sometimes literal intent. And that's the story I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell an Israeli narrative in which a leader of the settlement movement has this intimate relationship with Rabin, even as the settlers are in the streets calling Rabin a murderer. And so when you realize just what a complicated story this is, it starts to look, even our schisms start to look different.
I think you're an optimist at heart. I think the book is fundamentally optimistic, and having spoken to Yossi about this before, I ended up, having finished the book, much more pessimistic than the author of the book did.
Why is that?
Because I'm not persuaded that all the schisms are surmountable, or that we're surmounting them. And let's
See what happens tomorrow. That's a schism, I don't deal with it.
But I tell you, on the scale of schisms, I'm twisting myself here, that's one that we ought to go to solve with a bit of sensitivity. I really hope that we're talking about that. Absolutely. Now that might sound to you, that to me is more surmountable than the...
Really? I'm more pessimistic than
You know? Okay, so again, we'll see who prevails here. Now let's go back to the Ben Nun Rabin tragedy, assassination, schism, and let's come into the present. Because I think the thrust of what I believe you believe is that we're over the worst of this now, and that we didn't tear ourselves apart despite that assassination, and we pulled back from the brink of the abyss. Is that correct? Because we're right now, we're a Prime Minister who, at the very least, has already released dozens of, in many cases, mass murders in the cause of a peace effort. who has said, in principle, he supports Palestinian statehood, and who is alienating much of his traditional base to have done so, and is stirring opposition and so on. You're relatively sanguine, or as pessimistic as I am about how things might play out?
Less pessimistic than you. Well, let's take a step back and see what's happened to Israeli society over the last 20 or so years. The first Intifada and the second Intifada. The first Intifada, the dream of Eretz Yisrael Shema, of the complete land of Israel, was shattered for a majority of Israelis. Until the first Intifada, the settlement movement enjoyed majority support among Israelis. And I would say that even today, a majority of Israelis still have deep respect and affection for the settlers and admiration. But a majority of Israelis no longer support the political aims of the settlement movement. And we just saw a poll that I read in your newspaper. 75% of the Israeli public would vote for a peace agreement that Netanyahu would bring. It wouldn't vote, this is my interpretation, 75% of the public would not vote for a peace agreement that Labour would bring. But if the peace agreement comes from the Likud, then I think that poll that you published is right. So that's what happened to us in the first Intifada. In the first Intifada, a majority of Israelis came to the conclusion that we can't keep controlling a hostile population that doesn't want to be part of us and whom we don't want as part of our society. In the second Intifada, that same Israeli majority came to realize that we can't make peace with the Palestinian national movement. So in a way, the left won a certain argument during the first Intifada, the right won a certain argument in the second Intifada. And I think most Israelis today, this 75% that we're talking about, that I would call the centrist majority, whether they're right of center or left of center, this is the broad 75%. This 75% basically believes today two things about a Palestinian state. One is that it is an existential necessity for Israel because of the demographic reasons, democracy and a Jewish state. And the second is that it is an existential threat for Israel. And I think that I'll speak for myself as someone who's very much in the center. I feel deeply, deeply committed to these two mutually exclusive positions. And there are times when I wake up in the morning and it's a left-wing morning. and I say to myself, just whatever we have to do, just get out. Let's cut it, just cut it. And there are other days, more frequently, I have to admit, when I wake up and it's a right-wing morning, and I say to myself, are you out of your mind? Look around at the region, look where we're living. Let's just wait, let's just ride this out for as long as it takes, there's no rush, and we'll see what happens. So, and I think that most Israelis are there. So
coming back to my question.
Coming back to the question.
Maturing the Israeli.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, when I first came, when I first made Aliyah, you'll remember the show Politica, which then became Popolitica, and the late Tommy Lapid and other gladiators. Those of you who recall the show, it was an Israeli version of a talk show, and it was a shouting match. And I used to watch it because I was trying to learn Hebrew. And I would listen, trying to really listen very carefully to what was being said. And it was very hard to hear because everyone was, of course, speaking at the same time. And the moderator did not see his role as trying to get people to give each other a turn. The moderator would often join in the shouting. And finally, I realized that the purpose of Politica is not for people at home to hear new arguments that they've never heard before. It's simply to watch the spectacle. Because everyone knew that when Yossi Sarid spoke, everyone knew exactly what he was saying. You didn't have to hear it. And that was Israeli discourse until, I would say, the Second Intifada. And what happened in the last years is that a majority of Israelis began to really not just listen, but absorb the arguments of the left and the right, and create this kind of centrist ground. And the first politician to intuit the shift in the Israeli political culture was Sharon. Sharon understood that it's not the same Israel anymore. We're not arguing, or the majority of Israelis are not arguing about those issues anymore. We understand that it's really a disaster for us to be controlling other people, and we also understand that it would be a disaster for us to create a Palestinian state under these conditions. And so that's where most of us are. And the fact that we have a Likud prime minister who, in principle, supports a two-state solution, but is in no rush at all to reach a two-state solution, that, I think, represents the sensibility of the majority of this country. We want a hardline, pragmatic prime minister who's open to the possibility that maybe there's a change on the other side, but who doesn't really believe that there is.
It's really interesting. I'm going to let you know, I'm saying that, I'd love to happy to argue, but I'm not.
Go ahead, don't be shy.
I mean, the hysteria is always, I'm going to be shy. The hysteria is always at the extremes, and I'm worried that the potential for extremism is still there.
Yes, I do.
So I think everything of what you said there is spot on. Let me ask you, I want to come back to the essence of the book now, just for a little, because I was blown away, metaphorically speaking, by the battle scenes, which are, for those of you who have not had the pleasure yet, the writing is extraordinary, and it's as though you were there, and you were not there, fighting for Jerusalem in 1967. So the mechanics, how did you do that?
Going over and over and over with some very patient people. And I was extremely fortunate to develop what I would call not just a friendship with Arik Achmon, but really a partnership. Arik became my partner.
He sent you home for 2 years.
He sent me home to do my homework.
Let's learn a little bit about that before you have
yes.
temerities coming.
Yes, that's right.
And then he took you back.
He took me back. He recently told me that it took him another 2 or 3 years to feel that I was serious enough to really invest his time. And I think the skepticism was justified. And he held my hand and walked me through these scenes. He read 5 complete drafts in English of this book and endlessly corrected mistakes. And that was just Arik Achmon. There were over 200 people who were interviewed for this book, and for the Battle for Jerusalem, there were several dozen people. And so you get it from different perspectives. And also, the Battle for Jerusalem has been deeply covered. There are some wonderful books. Abraham Abramovich, Rabinovich wrote a wonderful book that was published about a year after the battle. There are some terrific books in Hebrew. There's Matan Gur's classic Halevi, The Temple Mount is in Our Hands, which is a minute-by-minute account of the battle for Jerusalem, which Arik Achmon actually provided the background for. So I couldn't have had a better tutor. And Arik took me literally to the battleground, and we went through it. We went up to the Temple Mount. We did the whole scene step by step. And
You walked the battle.
We walked the battle. And I walked the battle several times. I did it with Yoel Ben-Nun. So I got it from different perspectives. And of course I couldn't do the same with 73, the crossing of the canal. I couldn't walk the battle. But there again, I had the benefit of Arik's tutelage and of lots of very fine, detailed accounts. Now the paratroopers were very aware of their historic place. And so there are books that were published by the paratroopers themselves of 67 and 73. And they're fantastic books that were published for their own internal consumption. These were privately published books that include letters to wives and girlfriends, diaries, interviews with the paratroopers right after the battle. So the material is so alive and so fresh that I had my problem was that I had an abundance of material, and to have to really learn. I mean, it's to learn how to write about battle scenes was not easy for me. I did not experience war in my military service. I was drafted in the First Intifada, which was more of a police action than a real military experience. And so I really was a novice, and I came to this story as, in many ways, ignorant.
And you were transported by this book. You actually write it there about that Arik had called you a yellow Horovitz, and now you're in Israel.
I'd say so, yeah.
And you worked before, and you've lived here for 20 years.
20 years, yeah. You know, I used to think that you become an Israeli when you go to the army. And then I thought it'll happen when your children go to the army. And those are all very, very crucial steps in becoming an Israeli. But I think for me, the feeling that I really own this story was immersing myself for more than a decade in the minutiae, the military, political, and cultural minutiae. I'd say for me, in some ways, the most important experiences were learning the cultural nuances of the settlement movement and of the kibbutz movement and of the peace movement. So what was the first Peace Now demonstration like? And it was an extraordinary experience going back. It was after Saddam came to Jerusalem. Peace Now was founded in 1978 in response to Saddam's visit. And it's not before. Look, Gush Emunim was not founded after 67. It was founded after the Yom Kippur War. So these were all, it's the kind of information that I think we all somehow once knew and forgot. And so going back and reconstructing this, the first Peace Now demonstration. First of all, you look at the pictures, a sea of Israeli flags, hundreds of giant Israeli flags. If you didn't know that it was a Peace Now demonstration, you could have assumed it was a demonstration of the right.
Or an Independence Day.
Or Independence Day. But you know, when I listened to the speeches were all about patriotism, security, defending the land of Israel, but of course, with their conclusions. And so the culture of Peace Now, I think, was very different in those years than it is now. And then I had the same question of what was it like? What was the first night in the first settlement like? It was September 1967, Kfar Etzion. 15 young people in Kfar Etzion. And so these were the stories that interested me. It wasn't the broad strokes. I wanted to somehow return to us our story. And the story is experienced through the details.
It ends in the book 10 years ago. You ended around 2004.
2004.
And what thoughts and themes would you be developing for the decades since?
If I were to continue the story. Well, I ended in 2004 for several reasons. First of all, just from a point of view as an author, I loved my characters where they were in 2004. I felt that every one of them, in some sense, had reached the pinnacle of his development, and I wanted to leave them there. I didn't want to. I don't want to put it that way, But people get older, and I left them at their peak, the peak of their creativity, their insights, and so just from a literary point of view, that's where I wanted them to be. And 2004 was also the year when the Second Intifada ended, and we defeated terrorism. And I think that's one of the great unheralded, uncelebrated victories in Israel's history. The fact that we did what all the experts said could not be done, which was not just stop, but really defeat the worst wave of terrorism in this country's history. And of course, it's a year before the Gaza withdrawal, and everyone knows what's coming. And I have already written, I have devoted a full chapter to the withdrawal from Yamit in Sinai in 1982, and personally, I just couldn't bear going through it again. I mean, it was really, I realized I just did not want to write it again. So for those reasons and more, I ended where I did. To answer your question, David.
These are the formative years, and you've kind of said tonight as well that we kind of worked out the worst of our schisms, you think?
Well, I feel that the Israeli center had emerged in the early 2000s. And the implicit argument of the book is that this left-right schism has to some extent been I'd say, absorbed into the centrist persona. The left-right civil war is now happening inside many of us. It's not happening out there. So that's why I ended there. And if I were to carry it through the next 10 years, look, I think that what's happened to us as a result of the year 2000 is that we are in one prolonged war. This war does not yet have a name, but there have been several stages to this war. The first stage was between 2000 and 2004, and that was the suicide bombings. Then there was a lull, and then in 2006, we had the war with Hezbollah, and then there were the rocket attacks coming from Hamas, which of course never stopped in those years. And then 2009, we had Feret Yitzukah, the war with Hamas. And I see all of these battles as stages in a war that began with the collapse of Oslo. I used to call it the Oslo War. I think that all of these stages of this war have several facets in common. One is that the war, since the year 2000, has been directed not against the Israeli army, but civilian Israel. In every one of these cases, the main target is the Israeli home front. And the war has shifted from being an ostensibly nationalist war to a war that's being fought in the name of an extremist jihad. And so the nature of the war has changed, and of course, if you factor in what's happening in the region, then we're really in a totally different reality.
But that's not what you're working on now. You're not working on a follow-up. What are you working on now?
Well, at the moment, nothing.
Your wife at the time would be but you're planning more books in the future?
Inshallah.
Everybody, I've really enjoyed talking with Yossi this evening. I think, first of all, I think he's a lovely man. I think that's pretty obvious. And incredibly articulate. I hope for those of you who haven't read it, you should read it. It's as beautifully, elegantly, sensitively, articulately written as everything that Yossi spoke about this evening. He's not rushing on, so there's still time to get signed copies. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you very much.